Hi, I'm Kev Sheldrake and welcome to my talk for the UK Hypnosis Convention 2021. This year and last year have been very difficult with the pandemic and the lockdowns, but hopefully this online event will bring some joy and fun to everyone involved. I'm certainly going to find it enjoyable myself. This talk is about how to deliver suggestions and to get phenomena. So it's useful for the novice hypnotist who hasn't hypnotised anyone yet, for hypnotherapists who haven't yet made themselves invisible, for street hypnotists who want to improve their success rate, and even for stage hypnotists who want to be more efficient and effective. I run a company called Head Hacking with Anthony Jacquin, where we trained people to become street or impromptu hypnotists, and I've trained hundreds, if maybe even more than 1,000 of people to do that. Part of the course was that we would take people out into public when they'd learned the basics, so that they could actually hypnotise people who were weren't necessarily expecting them to be there and weren't necessarily expecting to have a hypnotist ask them if they'd like to be hypnotised. And that is a brilliant way of proving that the training works and that the students could get the big hypnotic phenomena which they'd come to learn how to do. So if you are a hypnotist and you don't currently go for phenomena, maybe because you're lacking confidence to ask for it, or you haven't yet learned how to deliver suggestions for phenomena, then this is the talk for you. It will help you learn how to get a stuck hand, name amnesia, and maybe even hallucinations such as invisibility. And so over the course of this talk, I hope to get you on the right track. I always say, if you want to learn how to give suggestions for big phenomena, then you should ask a street hypnotist. If you're in a bar and someone asks you what you do and you say you're a hypnotherapist, and their next question is can you hypnotise me now? You might hide behind the fact that you're not in your clinical setting, and you might say, well, I could hypnotise you, but only in my clinic. Equally, if you're a stage hypnotist and someone asked if you could hypnotise them now, they might say, well, of course I could, but only on a stage, on my stage. But if you're a street hypnotist, i.e. an impromptu hypnotist, and someone asks, can you hypnotise me now? You pretty much have to say yes, unless you've got a plane to catch or whatever it happens to be. So this is a talk about how to achieve that, how to be able to say yes, and how to be able to get good phenomena confidently in public with a high degree of success. Most of this talk is about the pre-talk and framing of hypnotism, because that's where I believe the work is done. Most novice hypnotists focus on the induction. Most advanced hypnotists focus on the suggestions. I believe the place to focus is the pre-talk. It's where the subject is set up to understand how to take your suggestions and how to act on them correctly. And if you skip that bit or you get that bit wrong, then the chance of your suggestions working is really small. So one last thing to mention before we move on. A free YouTube channel that I set up with Anthony a number of years ago is called How to Hypnotise. That's how, the number 2 and the word hypnotise. It features 8 lessons that we recorded in Las Vegas based on the Reliably plastic model or the model that's in Trilby Connection DVD. And that features very simple basic lessons for hypnotising in an impromptu setting, including notably the approach, the pre-talk and the health and safety sections. You'll also find other lectures on there that are useful. So the first thing to cover is law, safety and ethics. And law is really important. It's important because it's your responsibility as the hypnotist to make sure that what you're doing is legal, wherever that may be. In a pub, in a clinic, in a bar, in an aeroplane, on the moon, wherever it happens to be, it's up to you to check the laws that cover that area for the hypnotism that you do and the way which you do it. Now in the UK we have the infamous Hypnotism Act of 1952, which covers hypnotism for entertainment, and it covers places licensed for entertainment. And so if you are doing hypnotism in those kind of places, then the Act requires that you get a licence from the council before you do so. However, the Hypnotism Act has a very specific definition of what hypnotism they cover within the act. And I've got a copy of it here. Hypnotism includes hypnotism, mesmerism, and any similar act or process which produces or is intended to produce in any person any form of induced sleep or trance in which the susceptibility of the mind of that person to suggestion or direction is increased or intended to be increased, but does not include hypnotism, mesmerism, or any such similar act or process which is self-induced. So clearly I'm not a lawyer, but what I will say is that the way I perform hypnotism, I don't induce sleep or trance, and certainly not with the aim of increasing susceptibility to suggestion or direction, and all of the hypnotism that I perform is self-induced. That is, the subject themselves induce their own hypnotism. We'll come to the science later on in this talk, but for now you can bear in mind that the kind of hypnotism that I do in public is outside of the definition specified by the Hypnotism Act of 1952, and therefore isn't covered by it in any way, shape or form. But you probably want to speak to your own legal counsel before you make that decision for yourself. The next thing, which is very important, is safety. And again, safety is your responsibility. Inductions, hypnotic inductions, can cause people to react in unexpected ways. Some people, the induction itself causes them to have what people refer to as an aberration. It can cause quite emotional responses. Some people have all sorts of beliefs about what an induction will do to them, and they come out when you perform a hypnotic induction. So if you're going to perform with hypnotism, and specifically with hypnotic inductions, then I suggest you get training from someone who knows what they're talking about, which covers how to deal with certain situations like that. And I also recommend that you consider getting insurance should the entirely unprecedented, difficult or dangerous situation occur. And the other thing that's really important to consider is ethics. I would like to say, I think you should be a good person. I think you should ask for informed consent before you do anything, because some people can get upset or humiliated by the kind of routines that hypnotists sometimes roll out. And you can't always predict which things will be upsetting for certain people. So I suggest that you always ask, and you always ask for informed consent. So before you do any kind of routines, you check with the person that they're comfortable for that to happen. Very specifically, I think you should always get permission before filming anyone being hypnotised, and that doesn't just extend to you and your friends filming them, but also to all of their friends and any other strangers that happen to be there, because everyone's got a film camera these days in the form factor of a phone, and you could be halfway through your routine and they could just pull out their phone and start filming their friend. Well, they might have their eyes closed at that point and therefore not be in a position to know that they're being filmed. And when you get to the end of the act and they realise that's happened, they might not be comfortable with that. So I suggest from the very beginning you ask for permission to film if you want to film, and you certainly ask for permission for their friends to film in case anybody does. And if they say no, just make it clear to everyone that that is off the table and stop proceedings if someone does try to start filming it. In addition to permission to film, I think you should always ask for permission before you touch somebody in any way, whether that's part of your induction, whether that's a gentle tap on the shoulder or tap on the back of the hand or whatever. Just tell them you're about to touch them and ask for permission beforehand that will be okay. And I think the easiest way to do this is to make this sort of stuff part of your standard approach. So before you even get into the pre-talk, when you're talking to people about whether they'd like to be hypnotised, that you have a standard set of pattern that you roll through which asks these questions and asks for permission for these things. That way you can know that you've covered your bases and that what you're going to be doing is ethical and is not going to upset anybody. One thing I think you need to decide is whether you're a hypnotist or whether you're a magician or trickster. Some hypnotists use magic as part of their act, and they make a clear distinction which parts are hypnosis and which parts are magic. And some magicians use hypnotism as part of their act, and they make a clear distinction between the two. But there are hypnotists who use magic without making that distinction. And I think that's something that you need to think about. There's a hypnosis trainer who's used a heavy key as a demonstration of mind power. He'd put it on his hand, apparently he'd focus on it, and the key would move all by itself. And they put that down to mind power. They didn't say that was a magic trick. Now, they don't need to reveal how it's done, and I'm certainly not going to reveal to you how that is done. But I think they still need to say that that is a magic trick and not something related to hypnotism or indeed the power of their mind. Because they're a cheap trickster, and if they're prepared to lie about that, what else are they prepared to lie about? Now, it is true that responsiveness can be increased through the use of trickery. Academic hypnotists and researchers have used trickery to convince people that they've taken suggestions when they haven't. But is that something that you want to do? Aside from the ethical side, debate, obviously researchers are doing it for good research reasons, but if you're doing it and claiming it's hypnotism, is that ethical? Is that sound? Does that make sense to you? There are also other problems with it. I personally think it's disingenuous, and I think there are better ways of increasing responsiveness, which I'm going to cover in this talk. One of the problems is that if a trick fails, or someone reveals that something you're doing and claim to be a suggestion effect is actually a magic trick, then that destroys some of the belief in your abilities. If you're using the steeple fingers and claiming that the fingers will come together through mind power, through imagination, through hypnotism, whatever, and someone in the room, someone points out that well, that's just physics, that is a magic trick, if you do that they're always going to come together, then that destroys to some degree the belief in what you're saying, because you've lied and they've just called you out on it. It's not suggestion, it's a trick. And I think that has the opposite effect. If on the other hand you did something like magnetic palms, which is a purely suggestion based effect, largely based in ideomotor imagination, and those hands don't come together for this person you're doing it on, then what it implies is that the suggested effect doesn't work with that person. And the nature of suggestion is that it doesn't work with everyone. I think people appreciate that. So you could then move on and use somebody else and do use the same suggestibility test, and it will probably work. The difference between this and this is that with this, if it goes wrong or people call you out, it destroys it for the room, whereas with this you get to carry on. So my suggestion is that you stick with magnetic palms and stick with suggestibility tests, and that way you can at least call yourself a hypnotist and hold your head up high. When hypnotising someone, or when someone's accepted your invitation to hypnotise them, I think it's a good idea to always ask, what do they want? So back when we taught hypnotism at head hacking, we always taught to learn a routine and then to stick with that routine. Learn it verbatim, learn it well, learn the nuances, practice it a lot, and then when you go out in public, stick to the routine. Do the thing that you know. As they say, an amateur can do 1,000 shows, but the professional does one show 1,000 times. But when we discovered or developed the automatic imagination model, one of the things that came out of that work was to ask people what they wanted. And then whatever they said, to deliver on that promise, to promise to do that thing. So if you ask a hypnotist or a magician who you're trying to hypnotise what they'd like to experience, they normally will come out with all the sort of things that Derren Brown does. They want their hands stuck to things, they want to forget their names, they want to see things that aren't there or not see things that are there. But for the majority of the public, people who haven't been learning this sort of stuff or are in any way involved in it, the actual question I generally ask is, I say, if this is successful with you, what would you like to experience? Would you like your hand stuck to something? Would you like to forget your name? Or would you just like to feel amazing? Typically they will always go with feeling amazing, which is the easiest thing for a hypnotist to deliver upon. It demands very little from their capabilities and very little from yours. So then, as a hypnotist, you can absolutely promise to deliver that. But you say, but first we need to go through a few other things. And then we'll get to that, and I promise that we'll do that. This builds motivation and commitment from the subject. If they want to feel amazing, and you've just promised that you'll make them feel amazing, but first we have to do these other things first, like a hand stick, name amnesia, hallucinations, whatever happens to be your routine, then they're more likely to want to go through that process in order to get to the thing that they've asked for. Not only does it build motivation and commitment, it also builds expectation. You just promised that you can give them the one thing they want. So why wouldn't they expect that to work? And why wouldn't they expect the things that you're going to do before that to work? And it also makes them more likely to follow your instructions. Because if they want to feel amazing, and you say we have to do A, B, C in order to get to that, then they're more likely to follow those instructions to get to that point, so that they get the thing that they've asked for. So I always ask, what do you want? Whenever I hypnotise anyone in any setting. And I always promise to at least attempt to deliver on the thing they've asked for. I mean, you know, if they want to win the lottery, all I can do is either give them the belief they have won or the hope that they might win. But if they ask for something reasonable, I always promise to deliver upon that. But first we go through the routine that I want to go through. So now we get to the meat of the talk. The most important aspects about taking suggestions are the subject's expectancy, imagination, compliance, and self-deception. Now these things are in the territory of the pre-talk. If by the time you get to deliver suggestions you haven't set these things up appropriately and the subjects aren't in the right frame of mind, then it's too late. You won't have much opportunity to do anything about it. This kind of work needs to be done in the pre-talk, and in my opinion that's where the majority of the work is done in terms of setting up the responsiveness of the subject in every hypnotic session. This is often overlooked by novice hypnotists because the pre-talk is underestimated in terms of its importance. They think it's something to ramble through quickly, to simply remind the hypnotic subject of some lies about how they're in control or whatever, and just get on quickly to the induction and then the suggestions. Because what they find important are the induction and the phenomena. But I'm saying in the pre-talk you need to talk about expectancy, imagination, compliance, and self-deception. Now these don't go together in a handy mnemonic, so I've reorganised them into one that is easy to remember, and that mnemonic is exercise, and it stands for expectancy enhances response, compliance, imagination, and self-deception educate. And not only is it handy mnemonic, it's also true. expectancy really does enhance response. You need to be confident. You need to inform your subjects that they need to follow your instructions, and if they do, that it's most likely to work. You can inform them that most people respond well to these exercises, that it's fun and easy to do, and most people enjoy these experiences if they approach it with a motivated, open mind, and that they feel safe and in control. To learn more about expectancy, I suggest you read the chapters by Professor Irving Kirsch in the book Hypnosis and Imagination and Clinical Hypnosis and Self-Regulation. His work in these books is fantastic and well worth a read. More importantly, I think you should view hypnotic engagements, hypnotic suggestions, as a series of hypnotic exercises. The trouble with novice hypnotists is that they want to be powerful. They want to be able to wave a wand and have people do the things that they suggest. And they feel like a lot of these things relied on a binary can do or can't do, success or failure. And the problem is that some people won't take all of their suggestions. Worse, some won't take any at all. And even worse, it's impossible to tell apart the good subjects from the bad subjects just by looking. The only way you can tell is by giving suggestions, and sometimes that involves failure. But most people who persist with hypnotism do eventually realise that some people respond well and others don't respond as well, and that failure is just something that you have to live with. But that frame of success and failure is really the novice frame. It's not the frame that leads to good, fruitful, successful hypnotism. Instead, I think the frame needs to be more about the delivery of hypnotic exercises. If you say you're a hypnotist and someone says, "Can you hypnotise me?" then you say yes, obviously, because that's what your answer is going to be from now on. Then I would suggest that you say, "Yeah, I can take you through a series of hypnotic exercises, and together we can see how well you're going to do at them." Some people do really well, some people do less well, but if you enter into this with the right spirit and the right motivation, with the idea that this is going to be enjoyable and fun, then there's a good chance that you'll be able to succeed at all of these. Let's have a look, let's see how well this goes. What you need to be aware of is it's largely the subject's ability that will determine how well they take suggestions. And it's your responsibility as the hypnotist to enhance their expectancy. Good subjects don't need a pre-talk at all. They're already good. Their expectancy is up. They know what to do inside their heads when you give suggestions. They just get on and do it as if by magic. And to be honest, that is how good subjects appear to respond to hypnotism, as if by magic. But you can't tell a good subject until you've hypnotised them, until you've given suggestions. So we have to treat everyone the same at that point, at the point that we give the pre-talk. And so what we need to do is give everyone a really good pre-talk. We need to raise their expectation, and we need to explain the instructions that they need to follow in order to be able to take suggestions successfully. Now, most pre-talks are delivered as a script. They're written as a script, they're taught as a script, they're read as a script, and as I say, they really are delivered as a script. But not a script that a Hollywood actor is delivering, a script that someone who, let's say, isn't a Hollywood actor is delivering. Often they can be a bit dull, and they are almost entirely a monologue, where it's a series of instructions or statements being given by the hypnotist to the subject. Now, I think that most hypnotists don't really spend enough time on the pre-talk. I'm not saying you need to spend a vast amount of time on the pre-talk, but I would certainly put more effort into the pre-talk than any other aspect of hypnotism. What I think people don't realise is that it's not a list of things to say, it's a list of things or a list of ideas that need to be conveyed to the subject. It's imperative that the subject understands and explicitly agrees, in my opinion, that they want to experience the hypnotic effects, that they will follow your instructions to the letter, that they won't attempt to prevent the suggestions from taking effect, that they're not going to fight you, that they're going to be an active participant, that they'll fully engage in making the suggestions work, and that they expect that the suggestions will feel automatic to some degree. So as I say, good subjects don't need a pre-talk because they do all of those things automatically. But because we can't tell a good subject until we've given a suggestion, let's give everyone a good pre-talk. Let's make sure we give all of those statements. And let's make sure that they take them all on board and that we're convinced that they actually agree to them. It's one thing for a subject to nod along, and when you get to the end you say, "Got any questions?" and they say, "Not really," and you say, "Are you happy with all those things?" and they just sort of say yes. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's all gone in and that they're going to agree with you and they're going to do all of those things. So it's a lot easier to actually ask them good questions. You might want to ask, "Do you think you're going to be good at this?" Because if they say no, that implies their expectancy is low and that needs to be modified, or you should just stop and not proceed with this subject. But you can ask with all the things, are you prepared to engage fully with the suggestions? Are you prepared to try and make these things feel automatic? Ask those questions and make sure they're on board. As well as setting the scene correctly so that you've got some confidence that they're doing the right things, it also puts or implies that some of the responsibility for this is in their hands, or rather in their minds, and that if these things don't work, it's down to their skills, their abilities and their commitment as to why this hasn't worked, which is actually true, but also is a great face-saving mechanism. Passive subjects, that is, subjects who don't do anything in their minds when they're receiving suggestions, who think that their role is to just do nothing and that the magic of suggestions will just take hold and make things occur, are very, very bad subjects. They're the subjects where none of the suggestions get taken. What we want are subjects that do things in their minds. And when we talk about compliance, there's two ways that compliance gets used in the hypnotic literature. The way that Professor Irving Kirsch referred to compliance is more about the fact that they need to take instructions, they need to follow the instructions that you give them. So if you tell them to do a particular thing, as we've just talked about, then they are bound to do those things. Because if they don't, if they remain passive, or if they do the opposite, or they just do something completely random, then the effect of the suggestions won't take at all, and they'll be left without a hypnotic experience, and you as the hypnotist will feel that it didn't work. Hypnotism itself shouldn't be a battle. You're not fighting against a subject's will, you're not fighting against their ability to resist. It should be a collaborative exercise whereby together you see if they can experience some crazy things in an involuntary or automatic way. So I suggest don't work with anyone who thinks otherwise. Now, the other way of thinking about compliance in hypnosis is the way that Professor Graham Wagstaff defined it. He suggested a model for how subjects actually take suggestions, and that there's three parts to that. First, they try to work out what is appropriate for their hypnotic role and what is expected of them. That is, they try to work out what the suggestion is trying to get at and what they think the end goal of the suggestion should be and what their role in it is expected to be. Second, they apply normal cognitive strategies in response to the suggestions to make the experiences believable in line with their expectancies of what is demanded of them. And third, if the normal strategies fail, they simply comply or sham. Now, Graham Wagstaff says some subjects jump immediately from the first to the third. They understand what the role is and then they immediately comply. Others attempt the second phase and it works for them and they get the benefit of the suggestion with the feeling of automaticity without having to comply. But for those for whom it doesn't work, they end up in the third category where they comply or not. And the ones that don't, they fail the suggestions. The ones that do appear to succeed at the suggestions, but actually they're complying. It turns out that a lot of good subjects just comply rather than getting the experience of something happening automatically. When it comes to taking suggestions, the subjects aren't just imagining the suggestion happening. You know, if you ask them to hallucinate Beyonce, they aren't just imagining that Beyonce is there. But they are still imagining. That is in fact the only way they're going to see Beyonce, is if they imagine that she's there. But more is going on. We know that from brain scans, that there's a lot more going on in their head than just imagining. But we do know that they must be imagining. And what we also know is that imagining along with the suggestion is a good strategy to have that suggestion take effect. So doing nothing, as I've said, makes a poor subject, makes a subject that doesn't take suggestions. But imagining that the suggestions are going to work and imagining what that might be like is a good strategy for actually taking suggestions. You can see that in the magnetic palms suggestibility test or suggestion, and that is that we say imagine your hands are going to come together and touch. Now what I want is the subject to actually imagine that. I'm not just saying it for the fun of it, I want them to imagine their hands are going to come together and touch. And if in their mind they can see their hands coming together and touching, then that will happen to some degree. And we can build on the fact that there's some movement in order to make that work. This was based largely in the ideomotor effect that was described by Arnold in 1946. And that said that if you expect something to be the case, then your body will respond to some degree in order to make that the case. And I've seen through things like Chevreul's pendulum, etc., that if you imagine something to be the case, then the same thing occurs. So if you have a pendulum and you imagine it's going to go around in a circle, then your body will start to make the muscle movements to cause it to go around in a circle. And equally, if you imagine that stops, it will stop. If you imagine it goes forwards and backwards in a line, then it will go forwards and backwards in a line. That ideomotor effect has been known for 70 years. Now, Gail Comey and Irving Kirsch in 1999 did a study with 259 participants into what subjects are imagining while they're taking suggestions, and they gave them suggestions with goal-directed fantasies in them and suggestions without. Now, goal-directed fantasies are the means that would make a suggestion work. So it's like in an arm levitation, it could be the helium balloons that are attached to the arm that are going to pull it upwards. Or in a hand stick, it could be the glue that is sticking the hand down. For amnesia, it could be that your name is locked in a box and you can't get to it. And what they found was that if you remove those goal-directed fantasies, that means imagery from the suggestions, and you replace it with just repeated words from the rest of the suggestion. So they say, instead of saying, imagine there's helium balloons attached to your arm and it's going to rise lighter and lighter higher and higher in the air. They just say lighter and lighter, higher and higher. They found that without the goal-directed fantasies, the suggestions were more likely to be taken. That means that if you don't insert the balloons and you don't insert the glue, the suggestion is more likely to be taken by the subjects. It makes your suggestions more powerful. They also discovered that if you don't suggest the goal-directed fantasies, but a subject automatically invents them by themselves, then that actually works really well, and that's a hallmark of a highly suggestible subject. But it isn't something that you can force. So if they want to imagine their own balloons, they do, but you shouldn't be suggesting it. And another thing that they discovered, or they reported from that study, was that imagining the goal of the suggestion, so imagining that your arm is going to rise for an arm levitation, or imagining that your hand cannot be moved for a hand stick, was, in their words, a modal strategy even for very difficult responses, i.e. auditory and visual hallucinations. So they were saying that imagining the goal of the suggestion worked across the board on all suggestions and was a good strategy. So we don't entirely know what subjects do in their minds when they're taking suggestions, but we do know they need to do something. We know that if they imagine the suggestion working, and if they imagine the suggestion working automatically, then they are good strategies. And we know that if you tell them to imagine fairy tale items like helium balloons or glue, then you'll have lower response than if you don't. In Donald Gorosini's chapter of clinical hypnosis and self-regulation, where he talks about self-deception, he concluded that some people will pursue a self-deception attempt if the situation contains cues that can be interpreted as invitations to pretend. People who exhibit hypnotic responses tend to use a self-deception process to experience their suggested responses as involuntary. The induction of self-deception attempts in unhypnotizable individuals results in responses to suggestions being experienced as involuntary. And self-deception success is increased in hypnosis when the definition of reality one holds forms a good fit with observed information. So there's quite a lot to unpack in that. But basically what he's saying is that subjects that take suggestions engage in self-deception, and that if you induce self-deception in poor subjects, or as he regarded unhypnotizable subjects, then that causes them to experience their actions as involuntary. Now, had it not been for that second part, you could accuse Gorosini of simply relabeling suggestion as self-deception, and that would be one way to try to understand how self-deception might relate to hypnosis and suggestion. But that second part that says that if you induce self-deception in poor subjects, or as he refers to them, unhypnotizable subjects, then they experience their actions as if they were involuntary, which is the hallmark of the experience of taking suggestions. So this actually makes the idea of self-deception into a serious theory within hypnosis, because it turns poor subjects into good subjects. Now, to put Donald Gorosini into context, he worked with the famous Nicholas Spanos on the Carton Skills training program, which is a 75-minute program whereby poor subjects could be trained in 75 minutes to become good subjects. They went from being low hypnotizables to high hypnotizables simply because of a cognitive training program. And there's strong evidence that it worked. The original experiment has been recreated several times, and between 50 and 80% of low hypnotisable subjects became highly hypnotisable subjects as a result of the training. Now, some critics claimed that all it taught them to do was comply, as opposed to actually become good subjects, which is ironic considering Professor Graham Wagstaff says that that's what good hypnotic subjects are doing anyway. But they actually used the Carleton University Responsiveness to Suggestion scale, a hypnotic scale that measures how responsive a subject might be, which measures not only the behavioural actions, as in did the arm lift or not, but it also measures several subjective measures, including how involuntary the suggestions felt. And what they could show was that the highly hypnotisables that were made by the training were indistinguishable from highly hypnotisables that naturally occur. But they were distinguishable from those that had been instructed to fake hypnosis and fake being a good subject. Gorosini also made a 4-minute and 10-minute version of the training, which we refer to as brief training, and that is all. The scripts for those are also in the same book, the Clinical Hypnosis and Self-Regulation. In fact, the full Carleton Schools training program is in here, as well as variations such as the Connecticut version. Now, in a study that Gorosini did in 1997 involving 447 subjects, which by any stretch of the imagination is a lot of subjects, he found that 3/4 of them would wait for something to happen. And of those, half indicated that they would engage in the imagery that the hypnotist presented as part of the suggestion. So if you said your hand is stuck, then they would do nothing. But if you said, imagine that your hand is stuck, half of that 3/4 would actually engage in the imagination and the other half would do nothing. Of the remaining quarter, they all intended to produce the effect of the suggestion, but whereas 3/5 said that they were going to engage in self-deception, they were going to make the suggested response, 2/5 stated that they were going to comply with the hypnotist's demands. So to put those into some numbers that we might all understand, 37.5% of the people did nothing and nothing happened. They are the poor subjects. Another 37.5% imagine what they're told to imagine, and therefore they probably achieve ideomotor effects. Arm levitation involving the imaginary arm is lifting, for example. And they're not very good subjects, and they don't experience the effect of the suggestions as being involuntary. 15% engaged in self-deception, and they are the good subjects. They achieved the suggestion and they felt that it happened involuntarily. And the remaining 10% simply complied. So they did it, they enacted the suggestion, and they enacted it as if it was happening involuntarily, but it wasn't. They were going along with it because they thought that was their role. So if we add up those numbers, we can see that 25% of people get amnesia and hallucinations, for example, which is about the right sort of number. But of those, 40% of them are faking the involuntariness, and therefore faking the reality of the experience. The remaining 60% of that quarter, 15% overall, the good subjects, engage in self-deception. And the good thing about self-deception is that it can be taught. What subjects need to do is voluntarily produce the responses to the suggestion, and also interpret their responses as if they were involuntary or automatic. And you can see this in Gorossini's brief training, which was a 4-minute training program. I could summarise it as such. First, make the suggested response happen automatically. This simply means that you should make each of the responses that are suggested, but don't pay attention to the fact that you are making them. Second, devote all of your attention to the suggestions. Think of each suggestion as a little story that describes the events that are happening to you. Now, if you're aware of the automatic imagination model that I dreamed up with Anthony at Head Hacking, you might be amused to hear the words automatic and happening in that excerpt. So, in conclusion, exercise. Expectancy enhances response, compliance, imagination, and self-deception educate. Treat your subjects to some hypnotic exercises. So what about the actual hypnotising? Well, if you adopt exercise, then I think you should also adopt the socio-cognitive or cognitive behavioural theories of hypnosis on which exercise was built. And that means that there is no hypnotic state. There's no trance, there's not even a special process. I mean, scientists have been looking for decades, and most recently they've been using fMRI scans, but they've also been using CAT and PET technologies to study the brains of people before and after hypnosis, and to compare hypnotised people with non-hypnotised people. And try as they might, they have found no evidence whatsoever for a hypnotic state or for anything special happening as a result of an induction. They can detect if a subject is acting upon a suggestion or not, and they can distinguish between which suggestions hypnotic subjects are acting upon. And if your induction includes suggestions, such as suggestions to relax, then they can detect those suggestions themselves. But in absence of those suggestions, an induction by itself does very, very little. Technically, it provides a very slight increase in responsiveness. Not clinically significant, but a slight increase. However, the same increases can be gained by enhancing expectancy. So if you follow the exercise approach, you don't need an induction, and your suggestions will be just as likely to be taken. When I find inductions showy and mainly linked to the identity of the hypnotist, and as a result I sort of think they're a bit pointless. But there's also things wrong and difficult with using an induction. If the induction fails, then the show's over. You know, if you imagine that an induction is a suggestion to enter a hypnotic state, and the subject doesn't enter the hypnotic state that they imagine exists, then there's not a lot more you can do with that subject. You've already destroyed any expectancy they had that your suggestions will take, so they're not going to take your suggestions without an induction now either. But also, nobody really knows what a hypnotic state is supposed to feel like. It's all down to what the subject imagines it will be. Some imagine dreamlike feelings, some drowsiness, some imagine it's going to be like a drug rush. And others imagine sensations for which they have no actual words. Now, if the result of your induction process doesn't leave them with the thing that they imagine it to be, then as far as they're concerned, your induction has failed. So there's a high possibility that it won't work. And for the 75% who wait for something to happen, if you don't include any instructions to imagine in your induction, then it won't work for that 75% of people, because they fail to deceive themselves or fail to comply with the demands of the induction. I mean, in reality, an induction is just another suggestion. It's one with little value, but it has lots of opportunity for failure. And on top of the failure, inductions can lead to unpleasant and unexpected situations, such as abreactions. We don't necessarily know how a subject's going to respond when they've taken an induction. If they've got a lot of emotional baggage, if they've got a lot going on in their brain, if they've got ill preconceived notions of what hypnosis might do to them, then the result of the induction might cause an emotional outpouring. It might cause other issues that are just unnecessary risks that you don't really need. And for me at least, I feel like the result of an induction looks a lot like you're inducing sleep or a trance-like state. And as I said before, when I was talking about the law, that can lead to legal questions. So from a scientific perspective, the induction is unnecessary because there is no state and the induction is just a suggestion. But if that means that your hypnotism, in the UK at least, could be conceived by some to require a licence from the council in order to be able to do it in public, then I think that's one more reason not to do an induction. And certainly if it avoids any emotional situation, any abreaction or anything like that with the subject, then that again is a very good reason not to do an induction. And if you need one more good reason, when we watch Darren Brown on TV, from my perspective, when he gives suggestions without having done an induction beforehand, it's far more impressive. You know, it's one thing seeing a stage hypnotist go through the whole induction process and then tell someone that they can't remember their name. It's another one going up to somebody on the London Underground and just telling them they can't remember their name. That looks a lot more magical in my opinion. Now, when you haven't done an induction, where do you start? Well, I suggest you start with magnetic palms and then scale up from there, in the same way that we described in the Trilby connection and the way that we taught it on our courses at Head Hacking. Because there's no state, you don't need an induction, and because there's no induction, you don't need any deepening. You know, if there's nothing to induce, then there's certainly nothing to deepen. The magnetic palm suggestion should be possible with 62.5% of people. More if your pre-talk is good. And it's quite simple to do. You must have seen it, but if not, I'll quickly run through it. You say, put your hands out in front of you, 6 inches apart, and imagine that they will come together and touch. That's right. The more you imagine, the faster they'll move. They get closer and closer. That's right, you can feel them moving. And they're going to come together and they're going to touch. That's right, keep imagining that. And look, it's going to happen. And when they touch, well, whatever you want to say next, wherever you want to go. But what happens if that doesn't work? What if they put their hands out in front of them, you tell them to imagine that they'll come together and they don't? And you say, that's right, imagine that more and more. The more you imagine, the closer they'll come. That's right, they're moving fast now. They're moving. That's right, your hands are moving. Imagine them moving and they're not moving at all. Well, perhaps you want to tell them to close their eyes and then intensify that imagination, intensify the image that they're seeing. That often helps. Because with your eyes closed, sometimes people find things easier to imagine. But again, if they fail, given that this is largely based on an idiomotor effect, you might want to consider your options. Didn't you, was your pre-talk at fault? Did you not say the things that you should have said? Are they challenging you? Did they misunderstand the instructions and think that their role is to prevent their hands from moving? Is their expectancy low? Do they not expect this to work? Maybe sort of think back through what you said and see if you can work out why it's not working for them. I mean, in terms of what I like to call show personship, I consider myself like I'm the sober person at the end of a party of trying to corral drunken people out of a building. You must have been there. You're the designated driver, and you need to get your drunken friends out and into the car so you can get them home. And they're not the fastest people to move. You know, they're still involved in the thing they're doing. Well, I liken my approach to trying to make these suggestions work to how you might act in that situation. So you'd be friendly, but you'd also be authoritative. I like to think I'm relentless and I exude confidence. This is how it's going to be. Closer and closer, your hands are going to come together. Superior, but at the same time humble. Kind of like a shepherd. I'm coercing their imagination in the right direction, and I'm not deviating from that, and I'm giving off the vibes that this is only ending one way, and that is that they're getting out of that door and into that car. Or in the case of the magnetic arms, those hands are going to come together because you're imagining that they will. So because we're running out of time, I won't go through all of the other suggestions in any kind of detail. I mean, they're all in the head hacking products anyway. You can find them on the head hacking YouTube channels. Because it's hypnotism and not a magic trick, all the instructions you need are there. Like, just watch the videos and copy the words, basically. It's all about delivering them the right way with the proper pre-talk. And the pre-talk has been, you know, the content of this lecture. It's as simple as saying, imagine you can't remember your name. And now imagine that happening automatically. Imagine you could see Beyonce. And imagine that there is nothing you can do about it. I think you should plan, script and rehearse your routines before you deliver them to a hypnotic subject, whether that's in private or in public or wherever. I think it's important to know your patter and to know it inside out so that you deliver it well, and you can spend your time focusing on your delivery and not trying to remember your words or trying to invent your words or where to go with it. If you have to, you can hypnotise your soft toys, because they won't mind. You can hypnotise them over and over again until you're happy that when you go out and try this on a real human being, that the words will come naturally and flowing and you'll deliver them without having to think about it. I think every routine should be built in a 3-beat kind of format. So with the last beat being the punchline. If you read anything about comedy, then you'll find that same kind of structure there. It's just, you know, do something big, do something bigger, do something the biggest, and then that's the end of the routine. That way you have a standard format that people can understand. Open-ended routines that don't really have a punchline or don't really have anywhere to go or don't really have a finish don't really fit our expectations or the audience's expectations of what entertainment is. And really, if you're doing performance hypnotism, even if it's a demonstration of your skills to find work in your clinical practice or whatever it happens to be, it should still be entertaining, because that's what people are going to enjoy to see. So do have a finish to your routine, do have a way for it to stop, and make sure that stop is good. In terms of delivery, be enthusiastic and be excitable. Be excited about what you're doing and make them excited about what you're doing, because hypnosis is an exciting topic, and giving people suggestions and having them take them and experience them in an involuntary fashion is something amazing to behold. So, you know, you want to make it fun for you, for them, and certainly for the audience. And as I say, in terms of your overall routines, as in routines after routines, your whole session, stop early. You know, it's very easy if you find yourself in a situation with a good hypnotic subject to just carry on and do every routine that you've ever thought of, or every routine you've ever heard of, and start inventing them on the fly and just carry on and on and on and on. Well, that's only going to end badly, typically. You know, you're taking up someone's time, you don't know how long they committed to wanting to be hypnotised for, you're taking up your audience's time. Maybe people there wanted to spend time with each other, and now you've kind of taken over and dominated. You know, it's always better to be the person that people would like to see again than the person that they'll buy a one-way ticket to Syria to get away from. So the other thing to say is you really do need to get used to suggestions not taking, because it happens, and it happens worse if you're trying to do performance hypnotism, if you're trying to go for big phenomena, because some subjects just can't take those suggestions. So very much like cold calling, every failure is one step closer to a success. Every suggestion that isn't taken is one step closer to a suggestion that will be taken. So you just have to get back on that horse and keep on riding, because eventually it will happen. Treat every hypnotic situation as an exercise, and in that mode, failure no longer has to live with you. You can put the failure fairly and squarely on the subject, as long as you do your bit in terms of the pre-talk, where you enhance expectancy and you give them instructions about compliance, imagination and self-deception. Then as long as you've given those instructions in a way that they understand them and that they can follow them, if they don't, it's not entirely your fault. It could come down to their capabilities or their inability to play their role accordingly. As a hypnotist, there's only so much you can do. So you have to accept that sometimes things will go wrong and it's not actually your fault. So I guess the question that I get asked is, what do I do if I go out and hypnotise people? Well, I do a pure version of the automatic imagination model. There's a description of that model on cosmicpancakes.com, and I talk about it in some level of detail in my 2012 Change Phenomena lecture, which you can find on YouTube or is linked off the website. It's also the subject of the ripped apart product that I recorded with Anthony Jacquin that I think is still available. It's basically a conversational pre-talk where I talk to the subject about hypnotism, about what they think hypnotism is and how it might work, and I change their conceptions about what it actually is and actually what they should be doing inside their mind when they're taking suggestions. I don't do an induction, and then I'll give them instructions to imagine in a particular way. So you've been a great audience. I've been Kev Sheldrake. If you have any questions, you can find me in the bar. And here's to a great hypnosis conference, and hopefully a much better year next year. Cheers.